pawn to e4. You responded with pawn to c5. This is the Sicilian Defence. The main point of the Sicilian Defence is that we take control over the central d4 square. As we expect white to play pawn to d4 at some point, we want to trade our flank pawn for their central pawn. This trade gives black a long-term positional advantage. Alright, so the first system we're going to talk about is a fancy dragon variation. Here white goes for pawn to d4 because they need to open up their light-squared bishop. Now, you achieve what you were aiming for. You trade your c5 pawn, flank pawn, for their d4 pawn, central pawn. After that, black plays knight to f6, attacking the pawn on e4, and white defends it. And here we go. Pawn to g6. Black wants to fianchetto their dark squared bishop because it is otherwise difficult to develop. From the g7 square, this bishop will exert long-term pressure along the long diagonal, often aiming at white's knight on c3, the other knight, or even the queenside in general. This is called the Dragon Variation. It is named after the Draco constellation because black has a pawn structure, starting with the c5 pawn, that loosely resembles the shape of that constellation. Anyway, white usually continues with bishop to e3, and black places their bishop on g7. After that, both sides continue developing their pieces. Generally in the Dragon Variation, and in most Sicilian setups, the most dangerous attacking plan for white is to castle queenside. To do this, white often plays pawn to f3, which not only defends the e4 square but also prevents black from placing a bishop or knight there. Black continues developing, and white plays queen to d2, preparing to castle on the queenside. Both sides then castle, reaching a very sharp and dynamic middle game position. White often follows up with bishop to c4, placing the bishop on an active diagonal. Let's say black develops a piece, and then white finishes castling queenside. With opposite side castling, both sides are now expected to launch aggressive attacks. White will typically push pawn to h4 and then h5, aiming to open the h-file for their rook. Additionally, white often plays bishop to h6, trying to trade off the dark squared bishop on g7, which is the main defender of black's king. Because white's attacking plan is so direct and powerful, this line is considered quite dangerous for black, which is why some players choose to avoid the main line of the Dragon Variation. Of course, black has their own counterplay, and if you know what you're doing, the result is a sharp, dynamic, and complicated battle. The Dragon Variation is best described by the spirit of the famous song It's My Life. If the following describes your style, then the dragon may be the perfect fit for you. This ain't an opening for the broken-hearted. No silent lines for the faint departed. I ain't gonna be just a pawn in the crowd. You're gonna hear them scream when I play it out loud. But for those who prefer a slightly less reckless path, there's a strong alternative, the Accelerated Dragon. In the Accelerated Dragon, instead of immediately playing pawn to d6, black begins with knight to c6. After white plays pawn to d4, and the pawns are exchanged in the center, black still fianchettos the dark squared bishop on g7, aiming for the same pressure along the long diagonal, especially against white's center and queenside. White develops with knight to c3, and black follows with bishop to g7. In this position, black is already attacking the knight on d4, so white usually defends it. Then black continues with knight to f6. So far, the moves look very similar to the classical Dragon Variation. However, there's one key difference. Black's pawn is still on d7, not yet moved to d6. And that actually matters. Here's why. If white tries to follow the same attacking plan as in the main line, playing pawn to f3, then queen to d2, and preparing to castle queenside, the delayed pawn to d6 allows black a little more flexibility and counterattacking potential. But white's usual plan actually fails here. Thanks to your pawn still being on d7, you can immediately strike in the center with pawn to d5, without first wasting a tempo on pawn to d6 and only then d5. You get to challenge white's center in one move, right away. And once you play pawn to d5, white's position starts to collapse. They can't carry out their usual attacking setup anymore. If white captures, your knight on d5 jumps into the center with strong activity, putting pressure on multiple key squares. At the same time, this move opens up your dark squared bishop, giving you improved coordination and control. As you can see, white's position just doesn't look as strong anymore. Your queen becomes more active, your center is stable, and your pieces are coordinated and ready to attack. Even better, your bishop is already doing great work from g7, and now you can bring your light-squared bishop to f5, applying even more pressure. At this point, white is already struggling. And that's exactly what we aim for in all dragon systems: fast development, strong center control, and active attacks. The accelerated dragon is one of the best choices for black in the Sicilian. It offers dynamic play, a solid structure, and few real drawbacks, unless you count paying dues to the Sicilian Mafia. Now let's look at a common club-level response. Bishop to c4, jokingly called the "I don't know how to play" variation, where white misplays as if facing e5 instead of the Sicilian. In this setup, white plays as if black had played pawn to a5 rather than pawn to c5. It's not particularly dangerous. In fact, it's very uncommon at the professional level. But below the 1500 rating level, you'll run into it quite a lot. Sometimes white plays bishop to c4 immediately. Other times, they begin with knight to f3 and then play bishop to c4. But either way, the idea remains the same, and so does the response. Against bishop to c4, a great move is pawn to a6. This completely shuts down the bishop's diagonal, making it ineffective. It also prepares the central break pawn to d5, which strikes the bishop and gains a tempo by attacking it. Let's say after pawn to a6, white plays knight to f3. Now you can go hard on the bishop. One great idea is to play pawn to a6, a standard Sicilian move, which prepares for pawn to b5, kicking the bishop even further and expanding on the queen side. And sometimes, if white is careless, they might even lose the bishop entirely. Even if your opponent tries to prevent this plan by playing pawn to a4, you can continue with knight to f6, attacking the pawn on a4. No matter what white does on the next move, whether they develop a piece or push a pawn, you will eventually get to play pawn to d5, attacking the bishop and achieving what you aimed for: a strong central strike and a tempo gain. White is now forced to trade pawns, and you immediately gain central control. Their bishop is under attack with no good squares, so it must retreat, costing them time. You can calmly develop your pieces or play queen to a7, delivering check. With no easy block, white often has to move the king, losing the right to castle. And if they try to block, pawn to d4 wins a piece thanks to the pin. Now let's look at the Najdorf Variation, one of the most respected lines in the Sicilian Defence. Popularized by Bobby Fischer and later played extensively by Garry Kasparov, it's still a favorite at the top level. The Najdorf is so powerful because it's highly flexible. After knight to f6, black hasn't committed to any fixed setup and has many options, like pawn to b5, expanding on the queen side while keeping the position dynamic. If needed, for example, if white develops the bishop to b3, you're always ready to strike with pawn to b5, and then push forward to b4, kicking the knight on c3. If white plays passively, say bishop to a2, you can be more ambitious by playing pawn to e5, grabbing space in the center and chasing away the knight on d4. Your pawn on a6 also covers the b5 square, so white's pieces have fewer options and are often forced to retreat. However, if white plays bishop to g5, pinning your knight on f6, then pawn to e5 may not be ideal, as the d5 square could become weak later. In that case, you can simply play pawn to a6, defending your knight and keeping control over d5. That's the strength of the Najdorf variation. It's extremely flexible. Depending on how white plays, you can adapt your setup. You can even transition into the dragon variation if it suits the position. This flexibility is why nearly all top-level players have played the Najdorf. It's a powerful and dynamic choice for black. Thanks for watching. Try it out, crush your opponents, and I'll see you in the next one.